Chapter 4: Behavior and Attitudes. How much does what we are on the inside predict what we do on the outside? Philosophers, theologians, and educators speculate about the connections between attitude and action, character and conduct, private word and public deed. Underlying most teaching, counseling, and parenting is a simple assumption. Our private beliefs and feelings determine our public behavior. So, if we want to change behavior, we must first change hearts and minds. In the beginning, social psychologists agreed to know people's attitudes is to predict their actions. Genocidal killers and suicide terrorists have extreme attitudes that can produce extreme behavior. Countries whose people detest another country's leaders are more likely to produce terrorist acts against them. Hateful attitudes spawn violent behavior. But in 1964, Leon Festinger observed that changing people's attitudes often hardly affects their behavior. Festinger believed that the attitude-behavior relation works the other way around, with our behavior as the horse and our attitudes as the cart. As Robert Abelson 1972 put it, we are very well trained and very good at finding reasons for what we do, but not very good at doing what we find reasons for. In social psychology, attitudes are defined as beliefs and feelings related to a person or an event. Thus, a person may have a negative attitude toward coffee, a neutral attitude toward the French, and a positive attitude toward the next door neighbor. Attitudes efficiently size up the world. When we have to respond quickly, the way we feel about it can guide how we react. For example, a person who believes a particular ethnic group is lazy and aggressive may feel dislike for such people and therefore intend to act in a discriminatory manner. You can remember these three dimensions as the ABCs of attitudes: affect or feelings, behavior tendency, and cognition or thoughts. The study of attitudes is central to the social psychology and was one of its first concerns. For much of the last century, researchers wondered how much our attitudes affect our actions. How well do our attitudes predict our behavior? A blow to the supposed power of attitudes came when social psychologist Alan Wicker, 1969, reviewed several dozen research studies covering a variety of people, attitudes, and behaviors. Wicker offered a shocking conclusion. People's expressed attitudes hardly predicted their varying behaviors. Students' attitudes towards cheating bore little relation to the likelihood of their actually cheating. Attitudes toward the church were only modestly linked with weekly worship attendance. Self-described racial attitudes provided little clue to behaviors in actual situations. Many people say they are upset when people make racist remarks, yet when they hear racism, such as someone using the N-word, respond indifferently. The disjuncture between attitudes and actions is what Daniel Basson and his colleagues call moral hypocrisy, appearing moral while avoiding the cost of being so. Thus, surprising finding that what people say often differs from what they do sends social psychologists scurrying to find out why. Surely, we reasoned, convictions, and feelings sometimes make a difference. when attitudes predict behavior. The reason, now obvious, why our behavior and our expressed attitudes differ is that both are subject to other influences, many other influences. Our attitudes to predict our behavior when these are other influences on what we say and do are minimal. When the attitude is specific to the behavior and when the attitude is potent. When social influences on what we say are minimal. Unlike a doctor measuring heart rate, social psychologists never get a direct reading on attitudes. Rather, we measure expressed attitudes. Like other behaviors, expressions are subject to outside influences. Sometimes, for example, we say what we think others want to hear, much as legislators may vote for a popular war or tax reduction that they privately oppose. Today, social psychologists have some clever means at their disposal for minimizing social influences on people's attitudes reports. Some of these are measures of implicit or unconscious attitudes are often unacknowledged inner beliefs that may or may not correspond to our explicit or conscious attitudes. The most widely used attitude measure is the Implicit Association Test, or IAT, which uses reaction times to measure how quickly people associate concepts. One can, for example, measure implicit racial attitudes by assessing whether white people takes longer to associate positive words with black faces than white faces. Implicit attitude researchers have offered a various IAT assessments, the 141 million completed tests since 1998 have their report shown that implicit biases are pervasive. For example, 80% of people show more implicit dislike for the elderly compared with the young. People differ in implicit bias depending on their group memberships, their conscious attitudes, and the bias in their immediate environment. Some people exhibit more implicit biases than others. People are often unaware of their implicit biases. Despite thinking themselves unprejudiced, even researchers themselves show implicit biases against some social groups. For attitudes formed early in life, such as racial and gender attitudes, implicit and explicit attitudes frequently diverge, with implicit attitudes often predicting behavior better. For example, implicit racial attitudes have successfully predicted interracial roommate relationships and willingness to penalize the other race people. For other attitudes, such as those related to consumer behavior and support for political candidates, explicit self-reports are the better predictor. Neuroscientists have identified brain centers that produce our automatic implicit reactions. One area deep in the brain, the amygdala, a center for threat perception, is active as we automatically evaluate social stimuli. For example, white people who show strong unconscious racial bias on the IAT also exhibit high amygdala activation when viewing unfamiliar black faces. A word of caution: despite excitement over these recent studies of implicit attitudes hiding in the mind's basement, the implicit association test has detractors. They note that, unlike an aptitude test, the IAT is not reliable enough to assess and compare individuals. When other influences on behavior are minimal. On any occasion, it's not only our inner attitudes that guide us but also the situation we face. As we will see again and again, social influences can be enormous enough to induce people to violate their deepest convictions. So, would averaging across many situations enable us to detect more clearly the impact of our attitudes? Predicting people's behavior is like predicting a baseball or cricket player's hitting. The outcome of any particular turn at a bar is nearly impossible to predict, but when we aggregate many times at bat, we can compare their approximate batting averages. To use a research example, people's general attitudes toward religion poorly predicts whether they will go to worship services during the coming week, because attendance is also influenced by the weather, the worship leader, how one is feeling, and so forth. But religious attitudes predict the total quantity of religious behaviors over time across many. The findings define a principle of aggregation. The effects of an attitude becomes more apparent when we look at a person's aggregate or average behavior. When attitudes are specific to the behavior, other conditions further improve the predictive accuracy of attitudes. As Isaac Adjen and Martin Fishbane pointed out, when the measured attitude is a general one, for instance, an attitude towards Asians, and the behavior is very specific, for instance, a decision whether to help a particular Asian in a particular situation, we should not expect a close correspondence between words and actions. Further studies, more than 700 studies with 276 participants, confirmed that specific relevant attitudes do predict intended and actual. For example, attitudes toward condoms strongly predict condom use, and attitudes towards recycling, but not general attitudes toward environmental issues, predict intentions to recycle, which predicts actual recycling. A practical lesson: to change habits through persuasion, we must alter people's attitudes towards specific practices. So far, we have been to condition under which attitudes will predict behavior. First, when we minimize the other influences upon our attitude statements on our behavior. And second, when the attitude is specifically relevant to the observed behavior. A third condition also exists. An attitude predicts behavior better when the attitude is potent. When attitudes are potent, much of our behavior is automatic. We act out familiar scripts without reflecting on what we're doing. We respond to people we meet in the hall with an automatic "Hi." We answer the restaurant's cashier questions, "How was your meal?" by saying "Fine," even if we found it only so-so. Such mindlessness is adaptive. It frees our minds to work on other things. For habitual behaviors, we seatbelt use, coffee consumption, class attendance, conscious intentions are hardly activated. As the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead argued, civilization advances by extending the number of operations which we can perform without thinking about them. Bringing attitudes to mind. If we were prompt to think about our attitudes before acting, would we be truer to ourselves? Mark Snyder and William Swan, 1976, wanted to find out. 2 weeks after 120 of their University of Minnesota students indicated their attitudes toward affirmative action employment policies, Snyder and Swan invited them to act as jurors in a sex discrimination court case. The participants' attitudes predicted verdicts only for those who were first induced to remember their attitudes by giving them a few minutes to organize their thoughts and views on the affirmative action issue. Our attitudes become potent if we think about them. That suggests another way to induce people focus on their inner convictions. Make them self-aware, perhaps by having them act in front of a mirror. Maybe you too can recall suddenly being acutely aware of yourself upon entering a room with a large mirror. Making people self-aware in this way promotes consistency between words and deeds. Remember Batson's studies of moral hypocrisy in a later experiment? Batson and his colleagues 2002 found that mirrors did bring behavior into line with espoused moral attitudes. When people flip a coin while facing a mirror, the coin flip became scrupulously fair. Exactly half of the self-conscious participants assigned the other person the appealing task. Forging strong attitudes through experience. The attitudes that best predict behavior are accessible, easily brought to mind, as well as stable. And when attitudes are forged by experience, not just by hearsay, they are more accessible, more enduring, and more likely to guide actions.
Before we end this video, I would like to request you to hit the like button